It never ceases to amaze me how things seem to come together. A couple of weeks ago, you may remember, we had a lesson from the verses just before this that really lent itself to a discussion of Jesus. And then we broke for 1 week from our study of 1 Peter and talked about who Jesus is last week. This is a day when people talk about resolutions. January 1, 2017, it's rare for that to come on a Sunday. And the lesson really kind of lends itself to a discussion of what we plan to be and how we try to be what God has declared us to be. It also fits really well with Bob's lesson this morning. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. You know, sometimes we as Christians make things way too complicated. It comes down to this. Paul puts it this way: you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light. Be what God has declared you to be. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Be what God has declared you to be. If you missed the class lesson this morning, it's a shame because it leads right into the text that we're looking at today. You know, we do make things too complicated. A young couple was not raised in the church. They came to Christ late, and they were attending a rather large urban congregation. And being a large kind of urban congregation, multi-generational congregation, this was a place that had kind of modern songs. And one weekend, the husband was away on business, and while he was away, he visited a small country church. When he came back, his wife asked him about that experience. What was it like going to this little country church? And he said, well, it was a little unusual because they don't sing songs like we sing. They sing hymns. And she says, well, what's the difference between a song and a hymn? And he said, well, I guess I can explain it to you this way. If I were to put this to music, Martha, the cows are in the corn, that would be a song. But if I were to say, O Martha, dear Martha, hear thou my cry, inclinest thine ear to the words of my mouth, turn thy whole wondrous ear by and by to the righteous, inimitable, glorious truth. For the way of the animals, who can explain? There is in their hearts no shadow of sense. Hearkenest they in God's sun or his rain, unless from the mild tempting corn they are fenced. Yea, those cows in glad bovine rebellious delight broke free from their fences, their pens that they eschewed. Then goaded by minions of darkness and night, all my mild chilliwack corn they have chewed. So look to that bright shining day by and by, where all foul corruptions of earth are reborn, where no vicious animal makes my soul cry, and I no longer see those foul cows in the corn. He said, now that would be a hymn. And it just kind of goes to show that we, religious folks, Christians, have a tendency to make things more complicated than they really are. Yesterday over at Caleb and Ashley's, they had a board they brought over here so we can all remember as we go through the year how far short we've fallen of our resolutions. They had each of us write down a resolution. I didn't write one down, because I know how my resolutions go. But I thought, later on, if I were to have a resolution for this year, I guess it would be to keep things simple. One of my goals as a preacher is not to take simple things and make them more complicated, but to take complicated things simpler, to kind of make things understandable. And that's what I hope to do in my preaching during this next year. Keep it simple. There is a spiritual metaphor. We saw it this morning in Bob's class, and that's the spiritual metaphor of darkness and light. We see it in places like John 8:12. When Jesus spoke to the people, he said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. He says, I am the light of the world. And then he says to his disciples, you are the light of the world. In Ephesians chapter 5, verse 14, there's a little expression here. Most commentators think this is a part of a hymn or a song that the early church sang at the time when a person committed his or her life to Christ in baptism. They call this a baptismal hymn. Wake up, O sleeper, and rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Fits the metaphor of Romans 6. We died, we're buried with him in baptism. We rise to walk a new life. Christ shines on us. And that's kind of the thought of Peter. When you look at what we've studied so far in Peter, we saw in 1 Peter 1, verses 1 and 2, that you and I, in Christ, have been chosen by God. And we talked about what that means. Chosen by God. Out of all the people in the world, he said, those in Christ, those are mine. We saw in verse 3 how God has given us a living hope in Christ. In verse 4 and 5, we saw we have an incorruptible inheritance in heaven. In verses 6 to 9, we saw that things aren't always in this life exactly what we'd hoped they would be. We're going to suffer, and we're going to have to endure. But if we endure, that suffering is only temporary. The rewards are permanent. And I was just reading through the stuff that I've written on Revelation here recently, and that's a theme of what Jesus says to the churches. Be faithful unto death, and I'll give you the crown of life. What he's saying to the church there is this. The suffering you're going to endure may lead to your death. It doesn't matter. Be faithful. I'll give you the crown of life. You see, dying is not the end-all, be-all of everything. The crown of life is. We have what the prophets predicted, what the angels looked for. We have the things that the Old Testament looked forward to, the angels wanted to look into. That's what we saw in 1 Peter 1, verses 10 to 12 a couple of weeks ago. Robert Louis Stevenson grew up in this house in Edinburgh, Scotland. And one night, at dusk, his family saw him in that window right there, looking out. And they asked him, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm watching that man poke holes in the darkness." Think about that. As the lamplighter walked up and down the street, he took that long pole, he lit those lamps, he was poking holes in the darkness. And in a way, that's what Peter says we're supposed to do. That's what Jesus said we're supposed to do when he said, "You're the light of the world." We're to poke holes in the darkness. How do you go about doing that? In 2017, how do you go about punching holes in the darkness? How do you walk in the dark? Well, Peter says three things here. The first thing he says is you got to prepare your mind. You got to think the right way. Notice verse 13. Therefore, with minds that are alert and fully sober, set your hope on the grace to be brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealed at his coming. Set your minds on the right things. Change the way you think. Before you can change the way you act, you got to change the way you think. Now, there's an interesting expression here. The NIV translation makes it a lot simpler for us. Minds that are alert and fully sober. Minds that are alert. If you read the old translations, kind of like those hymns, you'll read an expression like this. Therefore, having girded the loins of your mind. And you scratch your head and you wonder, what in the world is that about? Remember that? Having girded the loins of your mind? What in the world does that mean? Well, you know, girding the loins was the way a person got serious about being ready to either compete in an athletic event or to work. And it went this way. And I always wondered, how did they go about girding their loins? Because they wore these long flowing, outfits, these tunics. Those things get in the way. If you're running or if you're working, they just get in the way. So what do? Well, first thing they would do is they would gather up, they'd pull up the material up waist high, and they'd pull it around into the front, and then they'd whip it up under between their legs, split it in half, come around and tie it. That's the way they girded their loins. And the idea was, get all that material out of the way so it doesn't hinder you in whatever it is you're doing, whether it's competition or whether it's work. Gird the loins of your mind. He's saying, get yourself ready to be what God has called you to be. Change the way you think. There is an acronym that we use in computerese, and I guess it really fits for life. Garbage in, garbage out, right? You put in bad data, you get a bad result. Garbage in, garbage out. Isn't the same thing true with us as people? What we fill our minds with is what ends up coming out of our mouths, what ends up coming out of our lives. Garbage in, garbage out. And so, Peter writes it this way, therefore, preparing your minds for action, that is, girding the loins of your mind, and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that we brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Get yourself ready to compete. You're looking at one of the best marksmen in the world. His name is Matt Emmons. Matt Emmons, one of the best marksmen in the world. 2004, at the Olympic Games in Athens, after the first 2 rounds, he was so far ahead of the competition that on his 3rd round, all he had to do was hit the target. He didn't even have to be close to a bullseye to win the competition. He pulled his gun up, he aimed, he shot. The shot didn't even register on his target. He went from being first to being 8th. And all he had to do was hit the target to win the gold. What happened was this. He was in lane 3. He hit the bullseye dead center in lane 2. He got distracted, focused on the wrong target. Distractions can be deadly. That's a good example of that, don't you think? You got to keep your mind on what you're supposed to be doing. He should have had his mind on lane 3 instead of lane 2. That's why he's explained to the judges right there what he did. He can't believe it. Lightning never strikes the same place twice, right? 4 years later, in the Beijing Olympics, this time it's the 50-meter prone event, he has a huge lead going into the 3rd round. All he has to do is make a mediocre shot to win the gold. This time, as he's bringing his gun down, he accidentally hits the trigger before he sighted in, misses the target, goes from 1st to 4th. One of the best marksmen in the world. Missed twice when it really counted because he was distracted and wasn't focused on all of the things he should have been thinking about. Peter says, just like Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, we're supposed to be lights in the world. We're supposed to be poking holes in the darkness of this earth so that when people see us, they see Jesus. So the first thing he says is you got to focus your minds. The second thing he says is you got to shape your conduct. The way you think affects the way you act. Your behavior is important. Look at what he says in verse 14. As obedient children, do not conform, literally stop conforming to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. You know, Paul makes this point in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. And the point is that we are not what we used to be. We're not